This class also has had as a subtext a response to popular theological thinking today about modern Israel based upon Old Testament language, where God makes promises to Israel, his special nation, since they were called out of Egypt and brought to the mountain and given the law and given the land and so forth. God was making promises to that nation, Israel. And so today, people see these promises in the Old Testament and they see that certain promises have not actually been given to Israel today. And so that when they look on a map and they see the nation of Israel over in the Middle East and they say what certain Old Testament predictions have not yet been given to that nation, therefore they believe that that nation still should be expecting those promises. This is a theology called dispensationalism. So when we understand better how the New Testament speaks of these things and uses the concept of fulfilling Old Testament scripture, we will see that that theology misses the mark. It misses this whole point about what the New Testament says about the Old Testament. So we want to understand the Old Testament in light of what Jesus and the apostles said about it, not about the kind of things you hear today by popular theologians about the Middle East and such. When he says here about the word fulfill in the New Testament, so we're going to read the word fulfill. And that's what Jesus come to do, is to fulfill the Old Testament prophets. But this man says, and he's correct in it, the Greek verb to fulfill means something much broader than this. And he was talking about prediction, simply prediction realized. A prediction would be something like Micah 5 and verse 2 that says, out of Bethlehem of Ephrathah shall come forth a ruler. And you can even see this in Matthew chapter 2, right? When the people came to ask about the king, where is he to be born? And Herod had the scribes go look at the Old Testament. They said, well, Micah predicted he was going to be born in Bethlehem. And so he sent, of course, to kill all the children in Bethlehem. So that's a straightforward prediction. But not all of the Old Testament that is fulfilled in the New by Jesus is simply a prediction that's realized in Jesus. And this is important, and we will explain it further right here. He says, in fact, most instances of the word fulfill do not even imply this kind of explicit prediction. And here he gives some examples. He says, when Jesus came to fulfill all things which are written about me, he's quoting Jesus here, in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. That's from Luke 24:44. He says, when Jesus came to fulfill all these things in the Old Testament, he was bringing to fruition the significance of the entire Old Testament, much of which was not predictive. So you read through the Old Testament, the books, and very rarely do you have an actual prediction of the future. So he gives these examples like Adam. See, you read about Adam, but there's nothing in the text that predicts there's going to be another Adam that's going to come. But we know the New Testament says that Jesus is the second Adam, right? Jesus being the second Adam. So that's what he means. Now, Adam was a type. He was a prefiguring of the greater man to come, Jesus, but it was not an actual prediction. So he gives some more examples, like the sacrifices of the Old Testament. There was no actual prediction there, but instead they prefigured the sacrifice of Jesus. And you learn a lot about the principle of sacrifice and what is entailed in that and why it's necessary and things. But as the New Testament says, it was not possible that the blood of bulls and goats could take away sin. And so God had to do something bigger and greater than that. He mentions the high priesthood. There's another one. The New Testament says Jesus is our high priest, but there's no prediction like that in a specific way when you read about the priesthood in the books of Leviticus and Numbers and those books there. Jonah, he mentions. Jonah was in the fish's belly for 3 days. Again, there's nothing predictive in the book of Jonah. But Jesus himself said, just as Jonah was 3 days and nights in the belly of the fish, so must the Son of Man be 3 days and nights in the heart of the earth. So he was showing a fulfillment, a completion of the prefiguring of the Old Testament that was not explicitly predictive. So he's here talking about Matthew's phraseology. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. When Matthew says that, he says, what Matthew means is this was to bring to completion what was spoken by the prophet, not necessarily a prediction, but anything that the prophet may have been doing or alluding to. Even if he was pointing to an historical occurrence, there could have been some type of a predictive element to it. So he says here, fulfillment does not exclude prediction, so there certainly is that, but it presents a much broader and richer understanding of what it means to fulfill. So he says here, we should actually think more in terms of foreshadowing or prefiguring rather than predicting. There's another phrase that we use, type and antitype. So there are types of Christ in the Old Testament, but when Jesus came, he is the antitype or the answer to that in the fullest way, the fulfillment of it. But the point is that we're going to be looking at this, and I want to give you probably the perfect example of this. If you be turning to Matthew chapter 2, and we're going to show an example here where Matthew says that this is a certain fulfillment of an Old Testament verse, and the verse itself is not predictive. There is nothing about a prediction in the verse, but this will also help clue us in on how the New Testament interprets and treats the Old Testament. This is key.